Hello, and welcome to the Mindful Movement Podcast. I'm your host, Les Raymond. Thanks for tuning in today for another episode. I had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Laura Kay today from Lasting Impact Wellness. She is the host, along with her husband, of the Lasting Impact Wellness podcast. We talked about many things around self-awareness and stress and self-compassion. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I hope you do too. Dr. Laura Kay, thank you for joining me on the Mindful Movement podcast.
Hi, happy to be here.
So you, along with your partner, Parker, run Lasting Impact Wellness, where you offer different coaching services to, help the well-being of your clients. And also, congratulations on a new podcast you just started, also called Lasting Impact Wellness.
Thank you.
To prepare for this, I listened to it a bit. Actually, I really enjoyed the episode today that just came out on self-awareness. It kind of grounded me to some of the things that I've felt I've valued over the years that occasionally will drift away from, and as the ebb and flow of life hits us. So it was nice to reconnect with some of that. And so again, congratulations. I think it's going to be great. I think you're doing something that you're going to be very good at doing.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So it seems like you guys take a pretty holistic approach to wellness at your facility. Has it always been that way? You're a traditional physician. So was there a shift at some point, or have you always approached wellness the way that you do now?
Well, that's a great question. My husband and I both spent a lot of years working clinically in emergency medicine, and we've held some various leadership roles throughout our careers, educational roles. And the other part of me that always brought me joy and was sort of a passion for me was teaching yoga. And I started teaching yoga probably about 25 years ago now. And that was always a huge part of my personal and my professional life. So a few years ago, I started thinking about how can I start to integrate my medical training and my passion for things like yoga, the mind-body connection, physical movement, meditation, preventative care. And then that led me and us to where we are now. And we had a lot of conversations around our goals, our values, and I think a lot of doctors often label themselves as healthcare workers. And not that that's a misnomer, but for some of us, particularly in emergency medicine, I think we're more accurately sick care workers. We see and care for patients who are acutely ill, they're in pain, they're in crisis mode, and many of them are not healthy at all. And I love the practice of emergency medicine, but there has been a big part of me that wanted to truly help people to start to optimize their health care and minimize their need for sick care. So, as you mentioned, my husband, Parker, and I, who's also a physician, we founded this company called Lasting Impact Wellness Group. And essentially, it's a health coaching and consulting company for individuals and groups. And it focuses on optimal well being and longevity. So, it's really about helping people understand their unique intricacies, what makes them who they are, and really see them, identify them, and then manage them and create sustainable change that will have lasting impact not only for themselves, but for those around them. So that was kind of the summary and the crux of what we're doing now and how we got there.
That sounds great. Actually, it sounds inspiring. I've been, I think, a cynic of like the Western medical model for a long time now. And on one hand, I definitely appreciate, especially the emergency side of things, where where I think the miracles really happen. You're in a car accident, you're on the ground, and there's a part of your body that's maybe supposed to be on the inside, but it's sitting on the street next to you on the outside. Like the fact that humans have figured out a process to fix that, put that back in, and get is truly miraculous. And at the same time, the system, I think, has handcuffed well-intentioned physicians, in a system where it's really hard for the preventative care to take place, or the really help like the chronic diseases that seem to take most of us out eventually. It's not that they don't want to, and sometimes it's not that they don't know how, it's that the system doesn't allow for them to get from A to B in a efficient way. Does that make sense?
Totally. And, one of the things about Western medicine, which is how I'm trained, and I fully believe in its beauty and its value, but it's a very reactive type of practice where of course, in emergency medicine, we're seeing people who they have a problem. But even if you think about primary care, there hasn't over the years been as much focus on preventative management. It's more about waiting until you get that thing, that diagnosis. Okay, now we need to manage it. Your cholesterol has been fine, suddenly it's not. Okay, now we need to manage it. Talk about some dietary changes, place you on a medication, as opposed to let's identify potential problems based on lifestyle habits, family history. Let's identify those a little bit earlier on in your course and in your life so that we can extend the years that you are well and you're not suffering from these chronic diseases. So I think over the last, I don't know the years, I would say decade or more, there has been a bit of a shift with emerging fields like functional medicine, where physicians are actually able to do now additional fellowships and additional certifications and trainings in more holistic medicine that incorporate some of these concepts of preventative care. And I do believe that as time goes on, that need, our population is getting older. So that need is going to be even more pronounced. And I'm seeing it a shift just in my own career that partners, colleagues, some residency classmates are starting to shift away from the more traditional training and embark on some of those additional trainings and fellowships, again, to be more holistic and more preventative. But I think it's going to take a really long time before the rest of the healthcare world catches up with that, unfortunately.
Right.
And yeah.
Yeah, I've had a lot of personal experience with different functional medicine doctors, and one thing that's I think been positive from that is they're asking different questions in general. They seem to not be thinking about what's the intervention to address this symptom. They're a little bit more curious of like why is this symptom manifesting, and also there's a slippery slope in that field of just over testing, and uh the stress, the unnecessary stress and roller coaster for the patient to go through, I think, excessive testing sometimes. And I'm sure there's times where it's needed or useful, but I think oftentimes people can do more testing than needed to get blood values that you could put too much weight on, because it's a snapshot in time, where really if they just said, okay, you're feeling like crap, what's the sleep situation like, or like just started working on things that are going to be like low hanging fruit for overall wellness, and just see if that moves the needle before you um go down some rabbit hole of over analyzing blood work.
And I like how you said kind of starting with the basics. How are you sleeping? What's your stress level? That's where this topic of well-being comes into play. And I wish that there was a bigger space for it within the healthcare world in general, but the bottom line is most doctors don't have time to discuss these
Right.
things. You have a 15-minute visit that's dictated a lot by insurance companies and things outside of their control. And if you have an additional concern that you want to discuss, you have to make an additional appointment and it's not included in your yearly physical. And I do believe that's a source of frustration for a lot of physicians. We don't come into this field to see fit patients for 15 minutes and then move on to the next. I I won't speak for the entire field of physicians out there, but I can't imagine. We go into this field in general because we want to connect with people and we want to help them. And a 15-minute appointment to just really discuss the basics from what's your are you drinking? How much is your alcohol use? Are you smoking these days? What's your exercise level, in a very superficial way? Because again, we simply don't have time. That's that's not providing long-term help and long-term care for patients. So people have to advocate for themselves and obtain their knowledge and their sources of and their resources elsewhere. And that's again where this well-being space comes in. A lot of what we do at Lasting Impact is approach organizations and say, here's your employee health program. And that's great. Employee health programs can be wonderful, but research shows that they're underutilized and they're probably not as useful to most individuals as they think they are. And bringing in a different type of program with unique offers that really focuses on the things you mentioned: sleep, stress levels, what are your relationships like, what's your social interaction like, how's your self-awareness, let's talk about that. And we really believe that that's where people are going to start to see improvements in their health. And but again, it doesn't quite fit exactly in with the Western medical world at this point.
Yeah. Saying that they are wellness programs are underutilized resonates with me. I run a gym and it's in an office building. And over the years, we've had a lot of like corporate memberships. And one part might be that the individual employee has no skin in the game since it's, paid for by their employer. But it is the lowest usage. I mean, it is the percentage of people that get their gym membership that's in the building that they work in,
Mhm.
um, they could be there in 30 seconds. They just don't use it. And I'm sure that's very common. A big part of it too is educating people and starting at the beginning and providing like a base of understanding, which makes the individual more likely to act for the right reasons when they have a clear understanding. And it seems like with the podcast you started, I assume that's a big part of it, just educating folks on some of the basics so that when you're using the valuable like one-on-one time or that there's already a foundation laid so that when you're talking about interventions, every intervention you mention, whether it be addressing sleep or some daily habit, you don't have to like start at the beginning. You have a resource that you could say, listen to episode 3, 5, and 6 or whatever, and then you could have a much more productive conversation when you're on the clock and they're being billed and such. And it's a much more productive model then yeah, you got 15 minutes. The doctor has no time to educate you. They just have time to add, what are the numbers, how much you smoke, like you said, how much you're drinking, cut back or whatever. They
Mhm.
can't explain like how that affects the sleep or how that affects redox or whatever system they think is relevant. You mentioned self-awareness. Boy, that really resonated with me today, listening to prepare for this, listening to your recent episode.
Good.
I know I personally have a habit, and it's something I've worked on and gotten a lot better at, but I have a habit of just cutting people off. And I know I've even gotten complaints on the podcast that I do that to my guests. It's not something I want to do. It's just something I've done for a long time. And recently I hate to say the word fight, but my wife and I had like a disagreement, which is a really rare thing, once every couple years maybe. And we had one recently. And part of it, what the gasoline on the fire during the experience was largely credited to me interjecting before she like finished and not having the self-awareness of like, how's this coming off? This is my best friend, my wife, mother of my children, my lover, you know, like just one of the most important people to me. And essentially I'm just like, you know, disregarding the quality of her experience based on the way that I'm like out of harmony with my values of self-awareness essentially. Um can you speak on that a little bit, how you see self-awareness factoring into like how someone's well-being manifests for them?
Sure. Gosh, huge topic, but I do think it's the foundation for all health and well-being, essentially. Getting to know yourself kind of inside and out, knowing what makes you you, being aware of your own body and mind signals. I talk about that in the podcast. That helps you identify red flags more clearly when they first appear. It helps you to see warning signs before they turn into crisis. And that can be something physical in your health, that can be something in your relationship, picking up on subtle words or body language from your spouse or your partner when they're sort of starting before the argument occurs. So that part of it definitely can apply to pretty much any part of your well-being. But so I think self-awareness is really, again, crucial for all of these things. There's a part in that episode where I talk about reacting versus responding. And I think that's a really hard task for a lot of people to do. And that's one of the underpinnings of self-awareness. It's how am I recognizing something that could be triggering me? And then how do I respond to that? And most people react. I think I used the example of the email in the podcast. And it's a classic. It was a classic for me when I was director of the department. And I would sometimes get these emails that would trigger some reaction in me. And I'd be sitting in my office and I'd say, oh my gosh, are you freaking kidding me? And I would want to immediately react and respond, but you have to learn the importance of taking that pause, taking a step back and saying, okay, if I react right now how I want to, I'm going to probably regret this in the long run. So allowing yourself, A, to recognize that the trigger has occurred, B, understand how your mind and body are reacting to it in that moment, and then C, taking that pause to be able to respond thoughtfully and deliberately, considerately, instead of reacting. So again, self-awareness is really it's the overall arching theme to all things well-being. And it sounds like a pretty basic concept, but it's something that people definitely have to practice and can get better at. And for me, it starts with just taking a pause to sit with yourself and see, okay, how am I feeling in this moment? What types of thoughts am I having about whatever is happening? What types of physical sensations am I having? And then using that data to sort of get to know yourself better and then choose to respond accordingly. And yeah, we could get into core values and how that connects and intentions versus actions, but we can all think of people who are a little bit low on that self-awareness, on the self-awareness level there. But I think the more self-aware we are, the healthier we are overall, for sure.
Are are there any like books that stand out or teachers that you gained that information about self-awareness from?
Well, I have to say I learned a lot about self-awareness through my own journey of self-awareness, truly.
Okay.
When I have been in leadership roles, I actually read quite a few books about leadership. And one book is Endurance, and it's about, I can't think of the name of the ship, but it's that ship that was, they were attempting to go through the Arctic Sea, essentially. And they basically got stuck, and how the team was led through that crisis. And I'm blanking on the name right now, and I usually
It's
know
okay.
that right off the top of my head. But the book is called Endurance, and it's a beautiful story about leadership. And so I think, again, a lot of my own journey through self-awareness of how do I respond to this email that may have triggered me? How do I respond to this person who said something that may have triggered me in real time? How do I deal with conflict in the workplace? How do I help guide my team through crisis? I mean, I spent 3 years leading my team through COVID in the emergency department, which was extremely challenging, and in so many ways, for all the ways you can imagine, and then some. And so again, I had to really do a lot of introspection at that time, and both at work, for myself at home with my family, and then also be really aware of what was happening around me, whether it be the well-being of my staff, how people were handling stress, were people showing up to work, all of those things. So I can't say that I gleaned much of it from a specific book, but honestly, a lot of a lot of practical practical knowledge and
Gotcha.
development of my own. And then again, leadership books and things like that. And then there's a book by Ryan Leake, where he talks a lot about, he's a big self-awareness guru, and he's written a few books, and he has speeches that you can watch on YouTube and such, and he's pretty good as
Okay.
well.
I remember when I quit, I was a long time drinker. And when I quit drinking, a lot of things came up and I started diving more into books that I guess were in like the self help category. And one of them was Emotional Chaos to Clarity. I want to say the author is Philip Moffat. And it was one of the few books that I read and then immediately had to read again. And in doing so, recognizing how disengaged I was, and I guess what a lack of self awareness. And you mentioned the word intention briefly a moment ago, but the disconnect from having the intention of my, like what you could say, my values, the things that were important to me, the disconnect from my actions to those, and how that really showed up in the way I was reacting to things as opposed to, like you mentioned, like responding a little bit more skillfully. Very meaningful book. But yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of tools that could work. It could be meditation. It could be, going through some kind of pain yourself and figuring out how to get through it. Could, who knows? Could be psychedelic. Could be whatever tool works for somebody to get the awareness to help you take a forward step. You mentioned stress. I assume with what you do, stress plays a pretty big role in the negative physical manifestations that you're trying to help people with. I also listened to one of your podcasts about like the physiology of stress. Can you give a quick summary? We have definitely talked about stress on this podcast many times. Can you give like the couple minute version of um, like connecting the dots of what goes on from the brain to the adrenals or such, like the HPA axis or something, to get people to understand a little context around what's happening to the body when we experience a stressful encounter or event?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Stress is sort of, as you mentioned, a big part of my world, and a big reason for the work that we're doing now. So, one of the key things to recognize about stress is that not all stress is bad, and acute stress can be really helpful at times. So, it's what prepares us to react in a protective way. It also, that's what gets you out on the stage when you're ready to give a speech. You have that little increased rush of adrenaline, that acute stress response that makes you actually put one foot in front of the other and get out there and do the thing that you need to do. It helps us get out of bed in the morning. So, when we talk about negative or detrimental stress, we're really referring to a chronic stress situation. So, when you think about the stress response, again, it was adapted. We're very highly adaptable creatures as humans, and it was adapted to protect us from harm. And essentially, when your mind or body or one of your senses senses a threat to you, then your stress response is going to kick in. And that involves, as you mentioned, a feedback loop from your brain to your hypothalamus to your pituitary gland, your adrenals. All of that stuff starts getting kicked into action, and it starts producing these neurotransmitters that will help your body prepare for this stressful or threatening situation. And I think I use the example of, a bear chasing you. So back in when we're living in caves and hunting and foraging for food, we needed that stress response to kick in if our ears heard a rustling in the bush, or we started hearing snorting from some large animal from behind. And these things are happening automatically. They're automatic systems. That's part of our autonomic nervous system. It kicks in whether we think about it or not. And that's adaptive, it's helpful, it's preventative. The problem is that when this system kicks in when we're not under a particular threat, and our bodies oftentimes don't know the difference between that major threat and something like our to-do list, our meetings, our keeping up with the schedules with our families, the sort of what seems like mundane tasks of our day to day. As they start to build up, it starts to trigger that stress response inside of us. And it doesn't always have to be this huge giant surge of adrenaline and cortisol. But when someone is dealing with these sort of lower level stressors, but they're building up over time, then that's what leads to chronic stress over time. And that's the part of chronic stress that can be detrimental. It has effects on our nervous system, has effects on our blood vessels, our heart, our brain, our kidneys, inflammation, all kinds of things. And that's where we start to run into trouble with stress. So again, it's helpful acutely when we need it to protect us, but it's not helpful when it stays simmering at this low level, but over time, and that's when it becomes really detrimental.
Yeah. And I've noticed over the years, I don't think many people even recognize the things that are the stressors. It's like I'll work with a lot of professionals and they like their job. So I think because they like it or they just have a really positive attitude, and it's not that they're compensating with their attitude, but they have this they're geared towards productivity and accomplishing tasks, getting things done, moving forward. And in doing so, and either being really productive or really enjoying what they do, which is great, they don't recognize that even that you enjoy it, 50 hours at the desk, staring at a computer under artificial lights, ungrounded, whatever, is stressful. Like that's so far removed. This is kind of brand new in this, even though we are adaptive, we've only been adapting to these environments for a very, very short period of time when you zoom out and have a kind of an ancestral approach or evolutionary approach to where we're at on the spectrum. So,
Oh,
or
and
even
there's,
go
sorry, go
ahead.
ahead. I was going to say, you sparked a thought that just because we manage it well, it doesn't mean that it's not affecting us. And that's a really important point to make, because I meet people all the time who they come in to, and I think I might reference this in the episode, but they come into the emergency department with a panic attack, and it may be the first time they've ever had one. And they're really trying to identify, what is this? What is this feeling? What is this sensation? And one of the questions we'll talk about is, I'll start to kind of talk about stress, and they'll say, yeah, but I'm not, I'm not that stressed right now. I'm just doing my usual thing. And then when we start to break down their usual thing, it's a lot of stuff, and they're managing it well. At least on the surface they are. They're getting all of their meetings done. They're showing up to work on time. They're doing all of the tasks that they need to do. They're also managing the household. They're getting the groceries. They're planning all of the meals. They're making the lunches. They're picking up the kids after school. They're doing all of the things that are sort of on their list and fulfill their roles in their life, and they're managing it on the outside. But on the inside, that's that chronic stress. That's that nervous system, that sympathetic response that's always on, because they're always on. They're never stopping, taking a moment, pausing, taking some deep breaths, letting that sympathetic response settle down for a little while. So they don't feel particularly stressed, but their body is telling them otherwise. And eventually, a lot of times, people who experience a panic attack for the first time, it's sort of like it's like a boiling pot that's about to boil over, and they were just managing it really, really well until it just basically explodes. And then that's when their sympathetic system just kind of goes out of whack. And they think, okay, gosh, what's happening here? So the goal is to get people to, as you mentioned, start to recognize those things, even if they're managing well, so to speak, identifying what are those potential little low level sources of stress, and building in time for themselves. Doesn't mean you have to get rid of those tasks or those things, especially as you mentioned, if you enjoy your job, for example, but understanding the need to schedule in time for some self-care and some connection with others, some social interaction, and focusing on the things that can help dampen that sympathetic drive a little bit, and start to strengthen up their parasympathetic, their relaxation mode, their rest and digest
Gotcha.
system, so to speak.
Can I pick your brain for a moment about, because you have experience as an emergency physician. When you mentioned panic attack, that also resonates with me. I had a panic attack once after a an athletic event, and I went to the hospital, and I was misdiagnosed with a heart attack,
Oh my gosh.
which led to a greater panic attack. I had two very small children at the time. I was 31 years old. I thought I was never going to see my kids again. They were calling in a helicopter. They wanted me to take was it nitro, and they gave me some aspirin, and the guy said they took one blood value. I think one of the cardiac enzymes was off because I just ran like 10 miles. And I had panic. So luckily, friend of the family knew somebody. There was a cardiologist came in. I demanded a second opinion, and luckily he came in and he said, "No, you didn't have a heart attack." But that was a traumatic experience. Turns out I was probably a little dehydrated for the amount of activity I just did, and they were ready to put me in a helicopter, and they had already told me I had a heart attack. So for like 6+ months afterwards, I would have I would like every time I would go out for a run, I was like, "Am I going to have one?" It was like I was afraid to do anything strenuous. There was a constant fear of having a panic attack. And in my experience with panic, a lot of what makes it worse is the fear of it getting worse.
Exactly.
When What advice do you have for people that, putting aside the lifestyle choices, so tapping into like your emergency experience, putting aside the things that we could support holistically, um, so that we generally don't get panic attacks when someone does have one or feel that, because I know it's unfortunately really common that people experience these. Um, in the moment, what do you find helps?
I love that question. This is what I sit and talk with my patients about. So, and I always start with the sentence that these things may sound kind of hokey or cheesy or easier said than done, but it really is, there's basic management to when you're kind of in that moment and things are starting to get revved up. When we talked about that acute stress, that sympathetic drive, everything getting revved up, that's what's happening when you're having a panic attack. Everything is revving up. That feedback loop of neurotransmitters from your brain to your adrenal glands and producing all these hormones, that is, it's like it's on, it's like it's on steroids. Forgive the pun. And it's just going and going, going rapidly. And then you're starting to have these physical sensations that arise. Your heart rate can start to beat really fast. Your breath will start to get more shallow. Some people experience panic attacks with very different symptoms. Oftentimes they can get tingling all over. There's generally this overwhelming sense of doom, like something awful is going to happen, or I'm going to die, or someone's going to come in here and take me away and put me in a mental institution. There's all these sort of somewhat irrational thoughts that happen, and that's from that sympathetic drive. So the key in stopping it is activating your parasympathetic branch. And the best way we have to do that, the easiest way we have to do that is through our breath. And what I tell people who experience this is it's really hard to do that in the moment. When things are revved up, it's really hard to breathe because you feel like someone's closing in on you or your chest is closing in. So that highlights the need to practice some breath work when you don't need it. So oftentimes I just tell patients, look, the easiest thing you can do is start to slowly count in your head from 1 up to 20 and close your eyes, visualize the numbers and breathe slowly. You can even breathe in, count for 1, breathe out 2, in 3, out 4, so on and so forth, get to 20, and then count backwards from 20 back down to 0. And as you're counting, think about intentionally and deliberately slowing down your breath. Again, it's really hard to do in the moment, but it will help. If you can do it, it will help. It will help mitigate that intensity of the sympathetic drive. So a lot of it again is breathing. Other things you can do is start to count your inhale. So pick a number. There's like 5, 6, 7 breathing is a really easy one that you can remember. So you inhale for a count of 5, and then you hold your breath for a count of 6, and then exhale for a count of 7. And again, when you're in that panic mode, it gets really hard to do this practice because that sympathetic drive is so powerful that it wants to interrupt your breathing. It wants to interrupt your counting. But if you can practice that and just stay committed to doing it, it will certainly help. Other things that can help patients I've found over and just friends and family who I know are keeping, some people keep a little mint or something in their, on their person, in their purse, or in their pocket. And if they start to feel a sensation of panic coming on, they take that candy or mint and put it in their mouth, because it, that sensation of having your salivary glands kick in, it's sort of stimulating that rest and digest of, okay, I'm
Hmm.
eating something, something's in there, and it can distract the mind as well from those racing thoughts that develop. So those are two tips. And then, people oftentimes get anxiety or panic in two very common situations. One is driving. There's something about the act of driving. Oftentimes it's because that's the first time in their day that they're not distracted by the outside world. Somebody's not speaking to them, and they're finally having a moment to sit with their own thoughts. And that's when things can start to race. So I always tell people, if you're driving and you start to feel a sensation come on, just pull over to the side of the road, put your windows down, get some fresh air in, and start working on those breathing exercises. And then the other scenario where a lot of people have panic is in the evening before they go to bed. Evening times tend to be worse for patients who suffer with anxiety and panic attacks. And again, I'm not a psychiatrist, but this is my experience. And I think one of the reasons, again, similar to driving, is we are on all day long, and then evening comes and you finally get into bed, and suddenly those outside distractions are no longer there. And then that kicks in all of your thoughts and emotions that you have been sort of pushing aside and ignoring all day. And so that can be a time as well. And in those cases, I definitely recommend some sleep meditations for people, guided meditations, guided breath work. That can be really helpful in the evening, because oftentimes it actually can really settle them, and then they just drift off to sleep, and it can kind of nip it in the bud before it actually starts.
Gotcha. What about body like orientation? So in that stress response, we have the adrenaline and cortisol that you mentioned. Most folks have probably heard of those. One of the things it's doing is moving blood and resources away from the center out towards the extremities so that you can use them to run or fight or whatever. Is it useful to lay on your back and like put your legs up, put your arms up to draw? Is that a like, I know there's some things where you're doing something to stimulate the sympathetic by like overriding that autonomic response, like with the breathing. Can you also override by like putting the blood back? Is that also a signal like, oh, if there's blood here, this must be a safe time? And is that helpful?
It's an interesting question. I don't know what the data would say behind that, but anecdotally, I would say I think the benefit in that scenario would be from actually slowing down.
Gotcha.
So less about the actual position, because you're correct, as you mentioned, in that sympathetic response, we're shunting blood to the vital parts that need it. So to the extremities, to the muscles, but we are also shunting it to the heart already, and that's why our heart rate speeds up, because it's part of that defense mechanism. It's considered a vital organ. It's really shunting away from things, mainly the gut, because it's not needed in that moment.
Right.
So again, I would say that position probably does not matter, but lying down on your back, for example, spreading out your arms and legs, that might be a position of calm for somebody just in general, instead of, sitting up or pacing, or, and looking all around, but getting yourself into a position of calm, whether that be lying down or sitting comfortably, leaning up against the wall or a pillow or something. And then again, using your breath to stimulate it. Your breath really is the number one thing that can activate the parasympathetic. And, there's clear science behind that. Your diaphragm's lowering, your vagus nerve is being stimulated. And that's the scientific and medical basis for why just one deep breath in and out alone starts to tell your body, okay, let me start to calm down here. So, again, if I could give your listeners one take home of one thing that they can do when they start to feel out of control, it's that intentional, deliberate, deep breathing. But like I
Gotcha.
mentioned, it's
What
hard to
about
do.
dietarily? Do you feel there's any dietary intervention in the moment that could help?
In the moment, no, not necessarily. Aside from water, I do tell patients to drink water. It makes them feel better. But I think caffeine is clearly proven to worsen anxiety and any type of stimulant that you're drinking
Gotcha.
or taking in. I mean, I know a lot of people who drink those 5 hour energy drinks and these
Can't imagine.
Red Bulls. I always say, if I drank one of those, I would be sitting in the corner talking to myself for an hour because it would just rev me up so much. So, caffeine intake is a big one. I ask people and patients about their caffeine intake a lot when it comes to anxiety and stress and panic, because that is clearly associated. So, I oftentimes tell patients to people, I keep calling everybody patients. That's a force of habit. But tell people to trade out some of that caffeine. Now, you don't want to cut caffeine, then you'll get other problems like headaches and such. But start trading out some of that, especially if you're suffering from, panic attacks or anxiety or feeling palpitations and things like that. And you
Gotcha.
mentioned dehydration for you. I mean, that there is a relationship there.
Right. There's something that has helped me, and I've dived a little deeper into, I guess what would be considered like the bioenergetic model of health that really focuses on metabolism and relationships between like energy and structure. And like you mentioned, the adrenaline and cortisol, and it's one of the many things they're doing is they're elevating to help um, increase energy availability, essentially. So they're increasing like gluconeogenesis, like making glucose out of our structure. So you're essentially tearing down a little bit of structure to get more energy to help you through the stress.
Mhm.
So one thing that I've was recommended that I found extremely helpful is sugar. Um, because these hormones are are elevating. One of the reasons is to give you sugar, is to get more sugar in the system. And I used to vilify sugar for a long time, but I realized reluctantly at first that the body runs on this stuff and has pretty efficient infrastructure for it. And I've noticed that if I have a legitimate serving of sugar, 1 to 2 tablespoons, it has a very noticeable, very dramatic, very quick effect on acute like stress, anxiety, panic. And I think that's why it literally gives a reason, I think, to tone down those stress hormones. Um, and I don't know if that ever does that ever happen in a medical environment, like when somebody comes in and they're in the emergency room, do they ever give them like a glucose drip or whatever to or glucose IV? Is that ever done?
So we do give IV glucose, but that's only for patients really who are hypoglycemic, where their blood sugar is low. I
But
don't
isn't that happening? And then the cortisol and adrenaline or the are the adaptive response to get it back up? Because you're
in a panic attack, you mean?
yeah, or I guess because panic is acute
Acute
stress.
stress.
So really any I guess maybe any acute stress. I mean, there's stress and there's non-stress.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting question. I would say I don't know that there is available data on that, but I can tell you that, there is something called an acute stress response or acute stress reaction in medicine where we actually in those instances when we measure people's blood work and we get their basic laboratory workup in
Right.
the emergency department, their blood glucose is actually much higher
Higher.
than it is at baseline. For
But isn't
example,
that what cortisol and adrenaline are doing?
well,
Or
they're
one
not.
of the things that they're doing?
Yeah, I mean they're changing the environment for insulin and glucose to work with one another, but I honestly don't know if there's a direct correlation with your then blood glucose level, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Um, and I would say again in practice, what we see is in these acute phase, we call them acute phase reactants, and other things like your white blood cell count, for example, can be elevated in these acutely stressful situations. And blood glucose is one that we see. Something example that comes to mind is a person who has a seizure, for example. Now, people can have seizures because their blood sugar drops very, very
Right,
low,
right.
but aside from that category, let's say it's a person who suffers from epilepsy and they forgot to take their medication for 3 days and they come in and they have a seizure and we get their blood work right at that point. A lot of times those acute phase reactants or those stress response findings in the blood work we can see elevated blood glucose. So it'd be someone who doesn't have diabetes, but when we get their blood work, their blood sugar is pretty high, and
Right.
that's an acute phase reactant. So
Right, because they're not coming. They didn't have a seizure because they had birthday cake. Like the blood
right.
sugar is not high because of dietary intake. It's high because that's the adaptive response.
Exactly. So I guess what I would glean from that, again, I don't know the data behind it, but I would say it's not the opposite, meaning in those stress responses, the blood glucose that we can measure is not dropping. If we saw that, then I would say, yeah, that makes sense that you give people glucose back, dietary sugar, intravenous sugar, then it could benefit them. But we actually, again, clinically, we see the opposite, where those sugar levels that we can measure, again, there's a
Right.
caveat there, that we can measure are actually elevated in those
I
situations.
believe they are elevated and they should be elevated. And I guess what I'm claiming is that I think they're elevated because those hormones are elevating them.
Right. But then tell
And
me,
intake of dietary sugar will have an inverse relationship on those stress hormones. So I've tested this a bunch of times now. I actually had a physician who's a client of mine try it because when I told her about this, she looked at me like I had a couple extra eyes or something. And um, she she's she's a doctor that teaches. So she says she gets like super anxiety prior to like her lectures and such. So I said, next time try a tablespoon of sugar, sprinkle a little salt on it before. And she did it and she said it worked. And then I
I'll have
said,
to try
next
it.
time try two, 2 tablespoons. Yeah, I think there is something there. I think sugar's so vilified in like society in general that it's really hard to be open-minded about it initially when we just think it's just such an enemy, but it's like the body does run on this stuff and we have a good system there. And one thing, and it that I think ties to the breathing that could be associated to helping the acute response has to do with carbon dioxide. Because when you're slowing down your breathing, which we know works, and it works for a number of reasons. And one, yes, is that signal, because that information on the vagus nerve is mostly northbound. So it's signaling, hey, this is a safe time. You don't need to be freaking out or whatever. Obviously, it's safe because look how calm I'm breathing.
Hmm.
And also, especially when you're focusing on those longer exhales, you are increasing carbon dioxide levels through through the Bohr effect. You are getting that carbon dioxide signaling to signal hemoglobin to release oxygen into the tissue where it could be used. So we're getting the good feeling of being oxygenated, which is important, by having that carbon dioxide level up. And carbon dioxide is a vasodilator, naturally. So oftentimes I know people were thinking about uh, nitric oxide as a vasodilator, but I believe that is an adaptive response. That's like the stress state, whereas the homeostasis state is carbon dioxide's doing that for you. And if you're breathing well, that could be, up for interpretation, that you have adequate carbon dioxide, which means your tissues have the oxygen they want. And I think there's a connection with that, with why sugar in an acute state helps, because running glucose through. So when you're in a stress state, you have hormones that are releasing structure, so proteins and fats, to be utilized, so that the protein has to go and get converted to glucose by the liver, but the fat can be sent to be used as fuel. Fat can act as like structure and fuel. But when fat's being run in the mitochondria to make energy, to make ATP, it doesn't make as much carbon dioxide per unit of time relative to glucose. But when it's in there, because when it's in the mitochondria being run, because of the Randall cycle, you can't run glucose in there. So you could run one or the other within a cell. So you're not allowing glucose, which also could be a stress, which makes the liver put out more glucose into the blood, which will elevate blood sugar. So if you take a snapshot, you'll see a high blood sugar. And in most stress states, you're going to see that elevated blood sugar. But I think ingesting sugar can help that, because you could get some sugar in the system, putting the brakes on some of the stress response and producing more carbon dioxide per unit of time, which our body likes, especially in that situation. I think there's a connection there. Now, I'm not an expert on explaining that stuff. I don't know, but I think there's something there. And I've tested now. I have a history of a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety and more panic attacks than I'd like, you know. But recently I've been really tinkering with that over the last, I don't know, maybe like 8 to 10 months as I learn more about this. And it's been really helpful, to my surprise, as someone that has viewed sugar as the enemy, when really we're really good at using it if there's nothing interfering with us using it. And things that stress us out are generally the things that interfere us using it. But it is calming. And I think one of the reasons it's calming is one of the same reasons that the slowing of our breath helps us in that same scenario. What's important, I think, is that there are a lot of tools that people could use. And I think breath is, the portal to that present moment, that is like the anchor that we all can use and control the dial, even though in the moment, as you suggest, it's super hard to do, and it's useful to have somebody there to say, take a few breaths, slow down your breath. So when you're in the thick of it, it's not the easiest thing to be self-aware enough to be like, oh, I'm experiencing panic.
Mhm.
Let me go down my checklist. Let me slow my breath down, count to 20 or 5,
Right.
6, 7, or whatever you said there. Yeah, it's interesting too. You mentioned you were running your department or whatever through COVID, and that probably had all kinds. So you have everyone in that field already has like a stressful job,
Mhm.
and then you layer on all these weird dynamics, which really throws things off. I know in my work, I'm going, somebody comes in, I'm asking simple questions like, how do you feel when you wake up? What's the bedtime routine? And they get into their job, and they have all had this uptick in stress, like this whole new layer for like a year or 2 or 3 um, of a stress that's like layered on top. And stress has this cumulative effect. And it's like the elephant in the room that people haven't recognized. It's like it's been swept under the rug already on a societal basis in a way. And it's like they've gained weight, not that they've stopped exercising, but like they don't realize that they have been affected. This has been a traumatic experience for many people, and different levels of intensity. And it's unfortunate to see that people are walking around and they don't even realize that you already had a stressful life, as most adults with like real jobs do, and then they have this crazy layer on top of that. What did you do to help in the work environment to help navigate that for like a collective of people, like a team?
Well, one of the things that made it so difficult during COVID was the fear of the unknown. I think we're all fearful of things that we don't understand. And that was the hardest part at the beginning of the pandemic, just not knowing anything about this virus and what it meant for us immediately at the time, and then what it meant for future generations and all of those things. So the unknown was the scariest for sure. Navigating through that was challenging. I wish I could say that I had a seamless, magical way of getting everybody de-stressed in those moments, but I think some of the things that were most important in those really stressful times were communicating with one another, checking in with each other quite frequently, leaving those discussions open, letting people feel like they could be vulnerable and they were supported. I think that was probably the biggest thing, again, at the beginning of the pandemic. And we definitely saw over time that there was this need for people to have outlets for their stress. For example, maybe providers would want to work one or two less shifts a month, or we had we had a time where we would just kind of have a group text and say, I'm feeling kind of overwhelmed this week. Can anybody pick up my shift on Tuesday? Things like that. So I think the support that was generated from a we're all in this together kind of feeling was really a beautiful thing, and it probably helped keep us going. As things progressed, we stayed, I can only speak for my group, we stayed very supportive of one another, which was again an amazing thing and really helped get us through that. I tried to, as the leader, be the person who shed some positivity on things and tried to show up to my shifts with a positive tone of, again, support. We're all in this together. Let's just deal with today. We can get through this together, and then tomorrow's a new day, kind of thing. So that was probably part of the things that got us through those hard times. I mean, there's no question that as a society, those few years of the pandemic have changed us, for sure. I like to think that there's some positive that came out of it, whether it was just those things I mentioned of understanding that you need to support people that you love or support people in your work environment, and trying to understand more about stress and the ways in which we manage it, the ways in which it's manifested within us individually. But it was a hard time. I mean, and yes, we're still feeling and seeing vestiges of it even today. And who knows what might happen in a few months when winter comes along again. And I like to think we're better prepared for next time, but I'm not so sure that's the case.
Gotcha. From For you personally, you seem to it's they're lucky. It sounds like your team was lucky to have you to be able to have the self-awareness and stay positive for that, and allow people to feel supported. What are the things that you do to help support yourself? Like, what are the anchor practices that you rely on that you think like offer a lot of, I guess, like bang for the buck that everybody could kind of tap into on a day-to-day basis, as far as like routines or practices that you feel support you on your own like journey of well-being?
So I try to start with self-compassion. I That's something that we often don't do, and it's taken me a lot of practice over the years to develop that as a practice myself. And what I mean by that is talking to myself and treating myself like I would my best friend. And some of that, I can give you a silly example. I had a friend who's in my neighborhood. She texted me the other day and asked if I wanted to sign up my girls for soccer when school starts. And I read the text and I got this sort of immediate feeling of, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to go to practice twice a week, and I don't want to commit to something on the weekends. And my kids are still young and they already do all these activities. And it started this kind of thing in my mind of, but maybe they would like to do soccer. And then I just said, nope. And I texted her back and I said, sounds fun, but not for us. I don't feel like doing that this year. And I'm okay with that. So again, not carrying around so much guilt with decisions that I make, or and learning how to say no to things and just being okay with that and moving on. So that's a big practice that has helped me to stay grounded over the years. And then, for me, fitness is a big part of what keeps me stress manageable. I won't say stress free because there's no such
Right.
thing, but stress manageable. And moving my body, physical movement every day in some capacity, and even approaching that with some self compassion. And what I mean by that is setting realistic goals is oftentimes something that we don't do. And probably about a year ago, I got into a bit of a rut where I was feeling overwhelmed. I was taking on too many tasks and I was neglecting some of that self care, and I wasn't working out as much as I had been used to. And I just kind of one day said, I am just going to commit to moving my body for 45 minutes a day. And it doesn't have to look, I don't have to make that look like anything in particular. Maybe some days that'll just be stretching. Maybe some days it'll be 15 minutes in the morning of stretching, a 15-minute walk outside in the afternoon, and then 15-minute dance party with my kids at night. But I'm going to
Nice.
commit to 45 minutes, and again, that's was my number. You could pick 20 minutes. So committing to something, but not putting a ton of pressure around it, makes it, I think, more doable and approachable. And then if I miss a day, it's not the end of the world. I'm not a bad person. So those things. And then I do practice yoga. I teach yoga. I still practice a few days a week, and I do practice meditation. Tend to I tend to meditate in the evenings. I do a lot of 5-minute sleep meditations and things. And that definitely has helped me with my sleep hygiene and my restfulness through the night.
That sounds great. What a great combination. Self-compassion, definitely overlooked. Um,
And getting
taking
outside,
yeah.
I think, is a big thing too. I don't know. I mean, it's something about when I was a kid, my mom used to force us to go out and get fresh air. She'd always call it, go out and get some fresh air. And I probably
Well,
resented her at times for it when I was a kid, but now I love it. I mean, I'm outside
and
constantly, and
the
that
sun
definitely,
is unfortunately like vilified.
I
And
love
it's
it.
like,
I
who
know.
doesn't feel better the second the sun hits you when you
Right.
walk up? Listen, if you listen to your body, it'll tell
Mhm.
you, getting sunburn, not good, but getting as much as you as you can without getting sunburn,
Right.
very good.
That feeling of warmth on your skin. Oh, it's nothing like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I've become a bit of a sun worshiper. It's interesting too. I feel as a kid, I used to get sunburn a lot, and now I don't, even though I get a lot more sun. I don't know if I'm like um, building a a more intelligent about building a tolerance like early in the season or
Mhm.
something, but something is changing. I assume it's positive, but so you still make time to teach yoga too as a practicing physician. You're teaching yoga and you have
Yeah,
kids and you're juggling a lot of stuff.
I am. And I go in, it waxes and wanes over the years, over the months. I've been really lucky to teach primarily at a studio here in town that has given me a lot of flexibility over the years. So I've I'll teach for a few years, take 6 months off, just depending on life and what's going on. And even that, again, when I start realizing that it's becoming a chore and a task for me and not something that I'm looking forward to and enjoying, then that's the signal to me that, okay, right now is the time to step back. And I'm very aware of that. And I really try to listen to myself when I feel that.
Gotcha. What's generally um the the most likely first place you start with like the average person that you're working with, as far as like what category of these practices? Like, do you generally start with um something that's more mindset related, like the self-compassion, or something fitness, like get out, take a walk in the sun, or is it more linked to like sleep habits or dietary things? Where do you usually find like the most success beginning for someone that's just starting to want to make a little change?
So, really strengthening that self awareness muscle, I call it.
Mm.
And because that's where you kind of get a better idea as to where you're starting. Um, how do I know how do I know what I need to do to fix my sleep if I'm not really taking an honest look at my sleep habits, as an example? Or, how do I know what kind of nutrition I should be putting into my body if I'm not really thinking about how this makes me feel when I eat or drink this certain thing? So really for us, it's starting with self-awareness, core values, intentions. That's what lays uh, the foundation and the groundwork for all of the future pillars of well-being, like the nutrition and the fitness and sleep and recovery. So I think that's probably where we do the most work with people and clients, is helping them to deepen that internal awareness, that expanded awareness, and then throughout the other pillars of well-being, so to speak, and other modules and sessions with them is when we can start talking about mindset shifts, self-compassion, habit formation, because it's not, those types of things cross into every category, of course, but again, that foundation is really all about, in my opinion, our opinion, all about self-awareness.
Gotcha. That's great. Well, I want to respect your time. We got a late start after having some technical
I
difficulties this
know,
morning.
glad we worked it out.
I am too. I really enjoyed this. I know we got into the weeds a little bit with the physiology, but that's just, I don't know, maybe the nerd in me that is curious and always looking for different opinions on that stuff and different ways of seeing things.
Well, I'm going to go back and look through my molecular biology and think
Enjoy.
think through all of those intricacies. I can't say I've gotten that far in the weeds on it in a long time. So you could be exactly spot on. And next time I feel anxiety or panic coming on, I'll be a good excuse to eat a giant chocolate chip cookie or something.
Right.
Something
It's
else.
funny you say that, because one thing I would touch on, I've worked with a lot of physicians where I'm their coach in the gym. And one thing I have noticed is, the way that they're trained to, there's so much information that has to be learned and then remembered, recalled, and brought back for a test. And one thing I noticed, like when we talk about maybe certain pathways, let's say it's the Krebs cycle or something energy production related, it's like they recognize all the steps, and they might even recognize the cofactors to get from one step to the other. But it seems like in the medical school system, what hasn't been taught to them is how that relates to how you live your day so that you make good energy. Almost like they understand the infrastructure there, but they haven't been taught how to use that to their advantage to live well. So
Yeah.
you could mention things and like, oh yeah, I remember that from school, whatever, but they're not taught to use that to help somebody that's in front of them take advantage of the tools they have to improve their health. It's an interesting, and this is a generalization, but it's something that I've noticed with the physicians that I've worked. They understand the lingo, but they've never connect the dots to like why I feel like this, or why this makes me feel better, which
Yeah.
is interesting.
Well, it's interesting that when you are a practicing physician, you just gain a lot of practical knowledge along the way as well. And I think some of that more textbook stuff, for lack of a better term,
Right.
gets stored away way back in your mind. And even if I'm going to finish this talk with you and I'm going to be like, all right, let me think through that breathing
What the
cycle
heck did he
again. And
say?
yeah. And,
Yeah.
and again, I'll maybe listen back to this and think like, oh, Laura, you were totally wrong. But in the moment, it doesn't change the fact that if somebody is hyperventilating, clinically, practically, what do I need to get them to do? Slow it down.
Well, right, for
Right.
sure.
So, regardless of what's happening to them molecularly, and they're in for conversations like this and practices long term, yes, helpful to know that. But it is funny how you say that, that textbook stuff does get kind of put in the back. And when there's someone in front of you and they're in crisis, you have to just sort of also know, okay, what works, what's not going to work in this moment, and then what is going to work.
Right.
And then, yeah, when you get put on the spot like this on a podcast, you have to
So
think back through your
it's
through your
just a
molecular
conversation.
biology. But I don't even know that I still have that book over there. I'm sure I do. My husband keeps every textbook ever made since probably he was in elementary school, so I'm sure it's in here somewhere.
Right. Well, I want to congrats you and Parker again on your new podcast. I think it's fantastic. I think
Thank you.
right out of the gate, you guys are doing a great job. So I'm looking forward to hearing more from it. And I encourage the listeners to go check out the Lasting Impact Wellness podcast. And for those that want to learn more about how to get more individualized or take advantage of your group or employee services, is it it's lastingimpactwellness.com?
Yes, that's correct.
Any other thing you'd like to add or share ways of folks to connect with you, Laura?
No, we're also open to email at info@lastingimpactwellness.com. And then we are on social media, which has been a step outside my comfort zone. And that's just, we're on Instagram at Lasting Impact Wellness. So thank you for the opportunity to chat with you. And as I mentioned before, I think even before we started recording, this podcast world has been a really interesting way to just meet new people. And I find that really fascinating. And I really do believe that we can all learn something from each other. It's why I love emergency medicine and meeting people from all walks of life. And I don't ever leave a patient interaction where I didn't learn something. So
that's great. Well, I've really enjoyed meeting you, and I appreciate you taking the time to talk with us. And for the listeners out there, always grateful for your listening. I hope everybody has a terrific day. Thanks again, everybody, for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I sure did. And I look forward to connecting with Laura again in the future. I hope you have a great day.